A lonely millionaire always spent Christmas alone until his new employee, a single mother, invited him for dinner at her home. He never imagined he would fall in love with her that night, changing their lives forever. A story of loneliness, love, and redemption that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment on where you are watching from. The biting wind of December swept through the avenues of New York with an intensity not seen in years. In the heights of the Upper East Side, Edward Henry's penthouse remained in a sepulchral silence, only the distant murmur of nighttime traffic echoing through the enormous tempered glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the illuminated metropolis. At 45, Edward had achieved everything money could buy: a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions, apartments in 3 countries, imported cars, and the feared respect of the New York market. But on that Christmas Eve, walking alone through the 500 square feet of Italian marble and exclusive designer furniture, he felt like a stranger in his own life. His hands, always perfectly manicured, adjusted the collar of his Egyptian linen shirt as he watched the Christmas lights twinkling on the surrounding buildings. It was ironic how the entire city celebrated with family, while he, the man who had built half of those buildings, had no one to share a feast with. The memory of his childhood haunted him, especially at this time. An absent father who chose business over family, leaving him in the care of a series of nannies while his mother consumed herself with antidepressants and empty social gatherings. The apartment exuded luxury in every detail. The Carrara marble floor reflected the lights of the Baccarat crystal chandelier, while contemporary artworks, a Vic Muniz on the main wall, a signed bronze sculpture in the foyer, attested to the good taste acquired over years of success. The gourmet kitchen, equipped with imported appliances from Germany, remained practically untouched. Edward lived off deliveries from Michelin-starred restaurants and corporate dinners, turning his home into little more than a place to sleep and shower. The intercom broke the silence at 8:30 in the evening, its sound echoing through the corridors like an unwelcome intruder. Edward furrowed his thick eyebrows, inherited from his paternal grandfather, and walked to the entrance hall. Who could it be at this hour, on the eve of the most important holiday of the year? The doorman, already known for his discreet efficiency, announced through the internal system, "Dr. Edward, there's a lady downstairs. She says she's from your company, Helen Anderson. Should I send her up?" Helen, his new administrative assistant. Edward hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the intercom button. In the 23 days since she had taken the position, after the previous assistant abruptly retired, Helen had shown a quiet efficiency that impressed him. Unlike other employees who tried to make small talk or prolong meetings, she executed her tasks with surgical precision and discreetly withdrew. But what was she doing here, at his home on Christmas Eve? "You can send her up," he replied, instinctively adjusting his posture and running a hand through his graying hair at the temples. As he waited for the elevator, Edward observed himself in the mirror of the hall. The angular face, marked by expression lines that denoted more worry than joy, the brown eyes his mother always said were identical to his maternal grandfather's, the square jaw that gave him an imposing appearance even in moments of vulnerability. At 45, he maintained his physical shape through a personal trainer who came 3 times a week to the building. But beneath the impeccable appearance, he felt exhausted in a way that no exercise could cure. The sound of the doorbell brought him back to the present. When he opened the door, he found Helen standing in the hallway, holding a small cloth bag and wearing a navy wool coat that, though simple, accentuated her honey-colored eyes. She looked nervous, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and Edward noticed for the first time how her brown hair, usually tied in a professional bun during work hours, fell loose over her shoulders, giving her a natural beauty that had gone unnoticed in the corporate environment. "Good evening, Dr. Edward. I'm sorry to bother you at home. I know it's late and the eve of a holiday, but—" "No problem, Helen. Please come in." She hesitated for a moment on the threshold, clearly impressed by the grandeur of the apartment. Edward led her to the living room, observing how she walked carefully, as if fearing to touch something too valuable. He noticed that her shoes, although well kept, showed signs of prolonged use, and that she carried a faint scent of cinnamon and clove, completely different from the expensive French perfumes he was used to. "Please have a seat. Can I offer you something? Coffee, water, a drink?" Helen settled at the edge of the Italian sofa, her upright posture revealing a careful upbringing despite the humble origins Edward was beginning to sense. She shook her head and took a deep breath, as if gathering courage to speak. "Dr. Edward, I came here because today is Christmas Eve, and I couldn't stop thinking that you would spend the night alone." The sincerity of her statement caught him off guard. Edward was used to calculated approaches, to people who always wanted something in return for their attention. But there was something in Helen's voice, a genuine honesty, that completely disarmed him. "Everyone should have a family to share Christmas with," she continued, nervously fiddling with the strap of her bag. "I know it might be inconvenient or inappropriate, but I would like to invite you for dinner at my place. It's nothing fancy. It's a simple apartment in Brooklyn, but..." "Helen, I understand if you don't want to go. I know we come from different worlds, and maybe I'm overstepping professional boundaries, but I couldn't find peace." "Knowing that, Helen," Edward gently interrupted, surprised by the emotion that tinged his own voice. "How long has it been since you've seen someone spending Christmas alone?" She stopped speaking, her eyes meeting his. "Never, Dr. Edward. Where I grew up in Savannah, that would be unthinkable. Even people without biological family were welcomed by neighbors, friends, even strangers. It's our tradition. No one spends Christmas alone." Edward felt something stir within his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in so long that he had almost forgotten it. It was as if a door sealed for decades was being gently pushed open, allowing a ray of light to penetrate a long-abandoned room in his soul. Would it really be welcome?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The smile that lit up Helen's face was like watching the sun rise after a long winter night. "Of course! My daughter Julia will be so happy. She's 15 and loves meeting new people. And the dinner, well, it won't be like what you're used to, but it's made with a lot of love." Edward nodded slowly, still processing the strange mix of nervousness and expectation he felt. Can I bring something? Wine? Dessert?" "You don't need to bring anything, Dr. Edward. Your presence is already the greatest gift." As she stood up to leave, promising to send the address by message, Edward remained seated, watching her head toward the door. For a moment, when she turned to say goodbye, their gazes crossed again, and he saw something beyond the professional kindness he knew. There was a silent understanding, as if she could see through the armor he had built over decades and recognize the lonely person behind all that prosperity. After she left, Edward remained motionless in the silent room, the aroma of cinnamon and cloves still lingering in the air as a reminder that for the first time in years he would have a place to go for Christmas. At 7 o'clock on December 24th, Edward stood in front of the bedroom mirror, questioning for the third time if he had made the right choice of outfit. He had discarded the Armani suit, too formal for a home dinner. The Italian linen shirt also seemed excessive. Finally, he opted for a light blue shirt, dark jeans, and a casual blazer. Even so, he felt like an actor rehearsing for a role he didn't know how to play. The GPS of the Porsche Cayenne guided him through a New York he rarely saw. Leaving behind the wide, tree-lined avenues of the Upper East Side, he entered a maze of narrow streets, old buildings, and small businesses that still resisted real estate speculation. The contrast was striking. While in his neighborhood the houses were protected by high walls and sophisticated security systems, here people walked peacefully along the sidewalks, children played in the streets, and the bustle of bars and bakeries created a community atmosphere he had forgotten existed. The building where Helen lived was a 5-story structure, probably built in the 1980s, with a facade of exposed bricks and small balconies adorned with iron railings. Edward parked the car, clearly the most expensive on the street, and spent a few minutes watching the activity around him. Entire families walked by carrying wrapped gifts, the sound of Christmas music escaping from open windows, and the smell of home-cooked food filled the warm December night air. When he rang the doorbell of apartment 4B, Edward felt a pang of nervousness he hadn't experienced since his college days. Helen's voice echoed through the intercom, warm and welcoming. "Doctor!" "Edward, you can come up, it's the 4th floor." The elevator was small and noisy, with scratched mirrors and a faintly woody scent of wax. As he ascended, Edward noticed the sounds coming from the apartments. Animated conversations, children's laughter, the clinking of cutlery. It was a universe of family life that he observed like an anthropologist studying an unknown culture. Helen greeted him at the door, wearing a simple yet elegant dark green dress that highlighted her eyes and the sun-kissed skin of someone who had grown up under the Georgia sun. Her hair was loose, with a few rebellious strands framing her face, and she wore only discreet lipstick and a pearl necklace that Edward suspected was a family heirloom. "I'm so glad you came. Please, come in." The 2-bedroom apartment was small compared to Edward's standards, but it radiated a warmth that his penthouse had never possessed. The living room, decorated with simple but well-kept furniture, had walls adorned with family photographs and a few plants that Helen clearly cared for with affection. The 2-seater sofa was covered with a colorful crocheted blanket, and the coffee table displayed cooking magazines and some textbooks. But it was the smell that impressed him the most. An intoxicating mix of roast ham, seasoned farofa, rice with raisins, and the sweet aroma of French toast ready for dessert. It was a fragrance that awakened buried memories of his own childhood, of afternoons in his paternal grandmother's kitchen before she passed away when he was just 8 years old. "Julia, come meet Dr. Edward." A teenager appeared at the door of what Edward assumed was her room. Julia was 15, but carried a maturity in her eyes that suggested responsibilities beyond her age. She was clearly Helen's daughter, the same honey-colored eyes, the same warm smile, but there was a silent determination in her that reminded Edward of himself in his youth. "Nice to meet you, Dr. Edward. Mum has told me a lot about you," Julia said, extending her hand with a firmness that surprised him. "The pleasure is mine, Julia." "Your mom told me you want to be a veterinarian?" The girl's face lit up instantly. "Yes, I want to work with wildlife, maybe in the Everglades or in the Amazon." "The Amazon rainforest." "I'm studying for the SAT, but I also applied to the University of Georgia." Edward noted the discreet pride in Helen's eyes as she listened to her daughter speak. There was something touching about the way she encouraged the girl's dreams, even knowing the financial difficulties such a choice would entail. "It's a noble profession," Edward commented, "and very much needed." "Do you have any pets?" Julia asked with the natural curiosity of her age. The question caught him off guard. "No, my routine doesn't allow for it." The answer sounded empty even to him. Helen gently intervened. "Julia, how about helping to set the table? The ham should be ready by now." The dining table was set with an embroidered tablecloth, another work of the grandmother, Edward suspected, and simple but impeccable plates. There were lit candles creating an intimate atmosphere, and a small ceramic nativity scene occupied the center of the table, surrounded by arrangements of fresh flowers. "Helen, can I help with anything?" Edward offered, feeling out of place in his inactivity. "Absolutely not. Today you are our guest, but if you want, you can choose the music." Edward examined the small collection of CDs next to the sound system: Simone, Elis Regina, Milton Nascimento, some Christmas compilations, and MPB albums he hadn't listened to in years. He chose a disc of Christmas songs, and soon the familiar chords of "So It's Christmas" filled the room. Perfect choice, Helen approved from the kitchen. Julia loves that song. While waiting, Edward observed the details of the apartment with a focus that surprised him. On the shelf, among textbooks and some novels, there were photographs telling a story. Young Helen, dressed as a bride in a simple ceremony, the same Helen holding a baby, certainly a newborn Julia. Photos of birthdays celebrated in that same apartment, always with genuine smiles, despite the evident simplicity of the resources. There was also a larger frame, with a picture of an elderly lady, with white hair and a kind smile, next to a wood-burning stove. Edward intuited that this was Helen's grandmother, the keeper of the recipes that filled the house with aroma that night. "This is Grandma Constance," Julia confirmed, noticing his interest. "She lived in Savannah and taught Mum everything about cooking. She passed away when I was 10, but Mum says she's still present every time we make her recipes." "Julia's right," said Helen, emerging from the kitchen with a steaming platter. "Grandma always said that food made with love carries the soul of the one who prepares it." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. When was the last time someone had prepared a meal especially for him? He couldn't remember. The dinner was served with a bounty that contrasted with the size of the apartment. Succulent ham, seasoned with garlic and spices, rice with raisins and nuts, bacon stuffing with eggs, potato salad with homemade mayonnaise, and the traditional accompaniment of candied fruits. Each dish carried an artisanal care that Edward, used to the gastronomic refinements of the best restaurants, recognized as something infinitely more valuable. Love transformed into food. "Mr. Edward, would you like me to serve you?" Helen offered. "Please just call me Edward, and I'll serve myself, thank you." During the meal, conversations flowed with a naturalness that Edward hadn't experienced in years. Julia talked about her plans for the future, her favorite subjects in school, and her passion for biology. Helen shared stories from Savannah about traditional festivities and the simple yet rich life of her hometown. "Tell us about your family, Edward," Helen asked at one point. "Do you have any special Christmas traditions?" The question silenced him momentarily. How could he explain that his family consisted of sporadic meetings with a mother living in Paris, consuming antidepressants and attending luxury spas? How to convey that he had no affectionate memories of family Christmases, only recollections of empty scenes in houses filled with expensive objects? "My family is small," he finally said. "My mother lives abroad. We're not very close." Helen seemed to sense the discomfort in his voice and gently changed the subject, a sensitivity that Edward mentally noted as yet another of her impressive qualities. As the night progressed, Edward found himself relaxing in a way he had forgotten was possible. The sound of Julia's laughter, Helen's natural kindness, the cozy atmosphere of the apartment, all conspired to awaken in him a sense of belonging that he thought was lost forever. It was almost 11 at night when Helen brought out dessert, golden French toast sprinkled with cinnamon and sugar, accompanied by freshly brewed coffee. Edward bit into the first slice and was instantly transported to a kitchen from decades ago, where his paternal grandmother prepared the same recipe on Sundays of his childhood. The taste was exactly as he remembered, before life became a succession of corporate commitments and formal dinners. "Is it good?" Helen asked, observing his thoughtful expression. "It's perfect, identical to what my grandmother made when I was a child." Grandma Constance always said that every Brazilian grandmother has the same French toast recipe in her heart, Julia commented, serving herself another slice. "It's like a genetic inheritance." Edward smiled genuinely for the first time in months. "Your grandmother was a wise woman." "She really was," Helen agreed, her eyes shining with sweet nostalgia. "She had a recipe book that was the family's treasure, all handwritten, with notes on when to prepare each dish, for which occasions, even advice on seasonings and cooking points." "Do you still have that book?" Edward asked, genuinely interested. Helen hesitated for a moment, exchanging a quick glance with her daughter. "I do. It's one of my most precious possessions, but I don't usually show it to many people." "Mom, show it to him," Julia encouraged. "Mr. Edward. Edward seems to understand important things." After a few moments of hesitation, he got up and went to the bedroom. He returned carrying an old notebook with a worn leather cover and yellowed pages from time. It was evident that it had been handled with care for decades. "This notebook is over 50 years old," Helen explained, opening it carefully. "Grandma Constance started writing it when she got married in 1954. Each recipe has a story." Edward observed the pages with almost reverential respect. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, with marginal notes made over the years. "Cornmeal cake for rainy Sundays," he read from one recipe. "Dulce de leche for when the kids are sad," said another. There were instructions that went beyond the ingredients. "Always stir with love, season with prayer, serve with a smile." "It's extraordinary," Edward murmured, gently touching one of the pages. "It's like a diary of family life." "Exactly. Grandma Constance used to say that each dish carries the energy of the person who prepares it. That's why she noted not only the ingredients, but also the ideal state of mind for cooking each recipe." Edward turned a page and came across a family recipe: vanilla cookies for special grandchildren. His breath slowed, memories flowing like a broken dam. His paternal grandmother, Grandma Alice, used to make identical cookies every time he visited her before she passed away when he was only 8 years old. "Edward, are you okay?" Helen asked, noticing the change in his expression. "Sorry, it's just that my grandma used to make cookies very similar to these. She passed away when I was very young, and I had forgotten how much I loved those moments in the kitchen with her." Helen gently closed the notebook and set it on the table. "You know, Edward, Grandma Constance always said that people connect through food. It's not just about feeding the body, but about nourishing the soul." Julia, who had been quietly observing the interaction, suddenly stood up. "Mom, could you teach Edward to make Grandma's cookies? That way, he could have a little bit of that memory back." The suggestion created a moment of awkward silence. Edward, used to delegating all domestic tasks, had never considered the possibility of cooking. Helen, in turn, seemed to hesitate between the desire to help and the fear of being inappropriately intimate. "I don't know if it would be appropriate," Helen began. "Please," Edward interrupted, surprising himself with the sincerity of the request. "It's been so long since I've done something with my own hands, something that isn't related to business or money." Helen studied his face for a long moment, as if assessing the genuineness of the request. Finally, a soft smile curved her lips. "All right, but only if you promise to be patient with me as your teacher. I'm not very good at explaining. I usually just do. I promise to be the most dedicated student you've ever had." They headed to the small kitchen, which Edward noted was impeccably organized despite the limited space. Every utensil had its place, every spice was labeled and arranged. It was the kitchen of someone who took cooking seriously, not as an obligation, but as an art. "First, let's gather the ingredients," Helen instructed, opening the cabinets. "Flour, sugar, butter, eggs, vanilla, and a pinch of love." "A pinch of love?" Edward repeated, raising an eyebrow. "It's Grandma's secret ingredient," Julia explained, who had joined them in the kitchen. "She said that without love, any recipe lacks grace." Helen began to demonstrate mixing the ingredients, her hands working with a dexterity born of years of practice. Edward watched in fascination as she measured the ingredients not with mathematical precision, but with an intuition developed through experience. "Now you try," she said, yielding her place at the counter to him. Edward hesitated for a moment, then began to mix the ingredients with the same methodical approach he applied to business. Helen watched for a few moments before gently intervening. "Edward, "You're mixing like it's a financial spreadsheet," she said, smiling. "Relax your hands. Feel the ingredients coming together." She positioned herself behind him, her hands covering his to guide the movement. Edward felt an electric jolt run through his body with the contact, an innocent intimacy that affected him more deeply than any romantic encounter in recent years. "See? Let the dough speak to you." "The dough can speak?" he asked, trying to ignore Helen's subtle scent, a mix of neutral soap and the lingering aroma of spices from dinner. "Of course. When it's just right, it will be smooth and pliable. If you overwork it, it becomes tough. If you undermix it, it gets sticky." Edward continued stirring, now with gentler movements, and gradually felt the change in the texture of the dough. It was as if he were rediscovering his sense of touch, using his hands for something beyond signing contracts and shaking hands in corporate meetings. "Perfect!" exclaimed Helen, when the dough reached the ideal consistency. "Now let's roll it out and cut the cookies." The process of rolling out the dough and using the cutters, small star and heart-shaped molds that clearly had been used for years, turned out to be surprisingly therapeutic for Edward. There was something meditative in the repetition of the gestures, in the concentration needed to create uniform shapes. "Edward, can I ask you a question?" Julia said as they worked. "Sure." "Did you always want to be a businessman, or did you dream of something different when you were a kid?" The question caught him off guard. Edward stopped cutting the dough for a moment, reflecting on a time in his life he rarely revisited. "When I was your age, I wanted to be an architect," he finally said. "I dreamed of building houses that made people happy, places where families would create good memories." "And what happened?" Helen asked gently. "Life happened. My father passed away when I was in college, leaving the business in trouble. I had to take over before I was ready. Architecture fell by the wayside." "But in a way, you still build houses," Julia observed. "It's just that now you build entire buildings where many families can live." Edward looked at the teenager with renewed respect. There was a wisdom in her words that he hadn't expected to find in someone so young. "You're right, Julia. I had never thought of it that way." As the cookies baked, the three settled back into the living room. Helen served lemon balm tea, and the conversation flowed naturally between childhood memories, dreams, and plans for the future. Edward found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years. His childhood mischief, the early tough years running the company, even some of his frustrations with the life he had built. "Sometimes I feel like I've built a gilded cage," he confessed at one point. "I have everything I thought I wanted, but I don't have anything that really matters." "Like what?" Helen asked. Edward hesitated, looking around the small apartment that radiated more warmth than his million-dollar penthouse ever had. "Like this," he finally said, gesturing to encompass the environment. "A family, traditions, the feeling of belonging somewhere." The oven timer interrupted the moment of introspection. Helen got up to take out the cookies, and soon the apartment was filled with the sweet and familiar aroma of vanilla. Edward watched as she arranged them on a plate, with the same care a pastry chef would apply to a masterpiece. "All done," she announced, offering the plate. "Your first homemade cookies." Edward bit into one of the still-warm cookies, and the taste instantly transported him back to his grandmother's kitchen, to the safe lap of childhood, to a time when the world seemed less complicated and more full of possibilities. "It's exactly how I remembered," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Grandma always said that the best recipes are those that feed the heart along with the stomach," Helen remarked. When Edward finally prepared to leave, it was already past midnight. The city had quieted down, family celebrations coming to an end. He said goodbye with warm hugs, the first genuine hug he had received in months, and went down the stairs carrying a small bag of cookies that Helen had insisted on packing for him. In the car, as he drove through the empty streets back to the Upper East Side, Edward reflected on the most meaningful night he had had in years. There was something about Helen and Julia, about the authentic simplicity of their lives that made him question everything he considered important. For the first time in decades, he had experienced what it was like to be treated not as a title or a bank account, but simply as a human being worthy of affection and attention. As he parked in the garage of his penthouse, Edward observed the stark contrast between the two worlds. The automatic lights turned on, the security system greeted him with its electronic voice, but there was no human warmth, no life pulsating between those perfect cold walls. He went up to his apartment carrying the bag of cookies as if it were a treasure. In the untouched gourmet kitchen, he opened the package and ate another cookie, savoring not just the sweetness, but the memory of the night he had just lived. For the first time in years, Edward Mendonça went to bed with his heart warmed by something money couldn't buy, the feeling of having been genuinely welcomed into a family. January arrived in New York with its traditional combination of sweltering heat and torrential rains that turned the city into chaos with traffic and flooding. Edward returned to work after the Christmas break with a strangely altered perspective. The penthouse, which had once represented the pinnacle of his success, now felt excessively quiet. Mornings began to be marked by a subtle anticipation, the moment when Helen would arrive at the office. Mendonça Inc. occupied 3 floors of a commercial building in the Olympic Village, with a privileged view of the city's ever-changing skyline. Edward ran his business from an office on the top floor, with glass walls that allowed him to observe the team's activity while maintaining the privacy necessary for strategic meetings. The environment exuded discreet success. Italian designer furniture, contemporary artwork, and a panoramic view worth millions. Helen worked in the anteroom of his office, at a desk organized with military precision. In the early days of January, Edward found himself making excuses to leave his office. Requests for specialty coffee, questions about already confirmed meetings, documents that needed to be reviewed once more. It was a behavior that puzzled him. At 45, he felt like a teenager trying to get the attention of the girl he liked. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she greeted him every morning, always punctual at 8 o'clock, wearing simple yet impeccable suits that highlighted her natural elegance. There was a respectful formality in her professional approach, but Edward noticed small signs that the Christmas night had created a subtle connection between them. A lingering smile, the way she remembered personal details he had mentioned casually. "Helen, would you recommend a good brand of specialty coffee?" he asked on a rainy Tuesday, approaching her desk. "Of course. My family has always bought from Santa Monica Farm in Paradise. It's a specialty coffee grown at altitude. Would you like me to order some for the office?" "That would be great. And how is Julia? Have classes started yet?" Helen's face lit up instantly. "They started yesterday. She's in her junior year now, focused on the college entrance exam. She spends weekends studying at the public library. If she needs any specific materials, books, or anything like that, just let me know." Helen hesitated for a moment, that family conflict between gratitude and independence flashing quickly in her eyes. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Edward, but she's managing well with the school books." Edward nodded, respecting the delicacy of the situation, but mentally noted the information. There was something in the way Helen spoke about her daughter, the pride mixed with concern, that made him... The music played deeply. He recognized the determination of a mother fighting to give her daughter opportunities she never had. The following Wednesday, Helen arrived at work visibly downcast. Her eyes were slightly swollen, as if she had been crying, and she avoided direct eye contact. Edward watched her through the glass walls of his office, noticing how she focused intensely on her work, as if using the routine to escape some personal problem. "Helen, are you okay?" he asked, approaching her desk in the middle of the morning. "I'm fine, Mr. Edward. Why do you ask? You seem worried about something." She hesitated, clearly debating with herself about how much she should share. "It's just a personal matter. nothing that interferes with work. Edward realized he was treading on delicate ground. As an employer, he should maintain professional distance. As someone who genuinely cared about her well-being, he wanted to offer help. As a man who was inexplicably attracted to her, he felt an almost physical need to protect her from any suffering. "If you need to talk, or if there's anything I can help with," he offered carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Edward. Really, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine, and Edward knew it. In the following days, Helen maintained her impeccable professional efficiency, but there was an underlying sadness in her movements, a worry she carried like an invisible weight. The revelation came on a Friday afternoon when Edward returned from an external meeting and found Helen on the phone, speaking softly but visibly distressed. "I understand, Mr. Johnson, but 2 months is too little time." "Are you sure there's no possibility of negotiating?" Edward pretended to be busy with documents on his desk, but he perked up his ears. "No, I know you have no choice. It's just that it will be hard to find another place on such short notice." "Yes, I understand. Thank you for your consideration." When Helen hung up the phone, Edward noticed how she took several deep breaths, clearly trying to maintain her composure. She remained still for a few minutes, staring at the computer screen without really seeing it. Edward faced an internal dilemma. Interfering would be an invasion of privacy, but ignoring the situation when he could help seemed cruel. Finally, he approached her desk with 2 coffees in hand, a plausible excuse for the approach. "I thought you might want a coffee," he said, offering one of the cups. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting the drink, but avoiding his gaze. "Helen, I didn't mean to overhear your conversation, but it sounded serious. Are you sure you don't want to talk about it?" She looked at him then, and Edward saw contained tears shining in her eyes. For a moment, the professional mask completely fell away, revealing a scared and overwhelmed woman. "It's the apartment," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "The landlord sold the building. We have 2 months to move out." Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Sold to whom?" "I don't know. Some construction company that's going to demolish it for a new development. The realtor said it's a big firm specializing in urban revitalization." A terrible suspicion began to form in Edward's mind. "Helen, can you give me the exact address of your building?" She looked at him in surprise, but dictated the address. Edward felt the blood drain from his face. He knew that address very well. It was on the acquisition list of Mendon Realty for the first quarter. The new Brooklyn project planned to demolish 3 old buildings to construct a high-end residential complex. "Edward, are you okay?" You suddenly turned pale. He had to lean on her desk, the reality of the situation hitting him with devastating force. Helen and Julia would lose their home because of a project he had approved months before meeting them. The urban progress that represented profit on spreadsheets had a human face, and that face belonged to 2 people who had become important to him. "I need to check something. Can you give me a few minutes?" Edward returned to his office with shaky legs and immediately opened the project files on his computer. There were all the details. The acquisition had been finalized in December, just days before Christmas. The schedule called for the start of demolitions in March, with keys delivered to residents by the end of February. He had personally signed the authorization for the purchase. His signature was there, authorizing the eviction of dozens of families, including the woman who had changed his perspective on what really mattered in life. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Edward, Mr. Mark Sanders is here for the 5 o'clock meeting." Mark was his minority partner in the company, a man 15 years younger than him, ambitious and solely focused on financial results. Edward had hired him 5 years earlier, impressed by his ability to identify profit opportunities, but he often felt bothered by his complete lack of consideration for the human aspects of business. "Let him in," Edward replied, trying to compose himself. Mark entered the room with his impeccable suit and Italian leather briefcase, carrying the frenetic energy that characterized him. Tall, thin, with dark hair, always perfectly styled, and designer glasses, he represented the new generation of New York business people, efficient, relentless, and emotionally disconnected. "Edward, how was your vacation? You look strange." "I'm fine. Have a seat. Let's review the quarterly projects." "Perfect. I brought the updates on the new Brooklyn project. Demolitions are scheduled to start in 6 weeks. We have 3 construction companies interested in the partnership, and the numbers are excellent." Edward pretended to examine the documents Mark spread across the table, but his mind was completely focused on Helen. How could he look her in the eyes, knowing he was responsible for her anguish? "Mark, about the Brooklyn project. How many families will be displaced?" "Oh, you mean the people from the old buildings? There are about 60 apartments in total. We've already sent out the eviction notices, legal, all within the law." "And where will these people go?" Mark looked at him. With surprise, she said, "Edward, since when do you care about this? The real estate market is like that. Some leave, others come in. It's the natural gentrification of the city. But these people have lives, stories, ties to the neighborhood. And we have investors waiting for returns," Mark cut in, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Edward, are you okay? I've never seen you question the logic of business." Edward realized he was revealing more than he intended. Mark was smart and observant. Any display of emotional weakness would be interpreted as an opportunity to take greater control of the company. "Of course I'm not questioning. I just want to make sure we're following all the legal protocols. Obviously, our lawyers have reviewed everything. The project is legally protected." Throughout the rest of the meeting, Edward struggled to maintain his professional facade, but his mind was racing. Was there a way to cancel the project? Could he delay the demolitions? How could he protect Helen without revealing the reason for his interest? When Mark finally left, Edward remained alone in his office, watching the city's hustle and bustle through the window. Down below, people hurried by, each carrying their own worries, dreams, and fears. For the first time in his career, he realized that his corporate decisions affected real lives, real families, real stories. The sound of Helen organizing her desk outside brought him back to the present. It was almost 6 in the evening, the time she usually left to pick up Julia from school. Edward watched through the glass as she carefully packed her belongings, the worry still etched on her face. He made an impulsive decision. He left his office and approached her desk. "Helen, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to talk about your situation." She looked at him in surprise. "Mr. Edward, I already told you it's a personal problem. I don't want this to interfere." "It doesn't interfere, but maybe I can help in some way. I know people in the real estate market. I can make some connections." The relief that washed over her face was almost painful to witness. It would be amazing if you could. Julia's so worried, and I don't know how we're going to find another place within our budget." "I'll see what I can do," Edward promised, knowing that his words were both a promise and a lie. He could not just help. He was the one responsible for the problem. That night, in his silent penthouse, Edward stayed awake late, analyzing all the possibilities. Canceling the new Brooklyn project would mean losing millions in already committed investments and facing the wrath of the investor partners. But allowing Helen and Julia to lose their home because of his greed was unthinkable. For the first time in decades, Edward faced a conflict where profit and conscience were on opposite sides, and for the first time he was unsure which side he would choose. February brought with it New Year's Eve and a series of events that Edward could never have predicted. During the first 2 weeks, he immersed himself in an obsessive investigation of possible alternatives for the new Brooklyn project. He consulted lawyers, reviewed contracts, and explored every legal loophole that might allow for a delay or cancellation of the demolitions. Meanwhile, he maintained his professional facade, but Helen began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. "Mr. Edward, are you okay?" she asked one Thursday morning when she found him for the third time that week, leaving his office at 6 in the morning, clearly having slept at the office. "I'm just sorting out some complex matters," he replied, adjusting his wrinkled tie and trying to mask the fatigue etched on his face. "Can I help with anything? Maybe better organize your schedule, move some meetings?" The genuine concern in her voice made Edward's heart tighten. How could she care so much about his well-being when he was the secret source of her anxieties? "No, thank you. It's a matter I need to resolve personally." What Helen didn't know was that Edward had spent the night analyzing contracts with a team of lawyers, desperately searching for a way to protect her without revealing his identity as the one responsible for the eviction. The options were limited, and all involved significant risks to his business. The situation became complicated when Mark began to ask questions about the delays in decisions related to the Brooklyn project. "Edward, the investors are demanding updated timelines," he said during a meeting on Friday. "You've seemed distant lately. Is everything okay with the numbers?" "The numbers are perfect," Edward replied tersely. "I just want to make sure we're not being hasty." "Hasty? Man, this project has been on the table for 6 months. The feasibility studies were approved, the land acquired, the permits issued. What more do you want to analyze?" Edward realized he was treading on dangerous ground. Mark was ambitious and wouldn't hesitate to question his leadership if he suspected any indecision or, worse, sentimental motivation. "I want to review some technical aspects before proceeding." Technical aspects like what, exactly? The question hung in the air like a trap. Edward knew that any technical justification would be easily contested by the engineering reports they already had. "I'll have the details next week," he finally said, abruptly ending the conversation. The event that would change the course of the entire situation happened on New Year's Eve. Edward had received an invitation to a party at the Plaza Hotel, an annual event that brought together the business elite of New York and Los Angeles. Normally, he attended such events more out of social obligation than pleasure, but that year he decided to accept in hopes that a change of scenery would help clear his thoughts. The hotel was decorated with the typical opulence of New Year's Eve: golden feathers, crystals reflecting colorful lights, and live music creating an atmosphere of sophisticated celebration. Edward mingled among the guests, greeting acquaintances and trying to maintain conversations that couldn't hold his attention for more than a few minutes. As he was heading to the bar, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. "Edward! Edward Henry!" He turned around and saw a woman in her 40s approaching with a radiant smile. She was clearly from the countryside. She had the same southern accent as Helen, the same natural warmth, but with a more rustic appearance, grey hair tied back in a simple bun, and wearing a dress that, although dressed up for the occasion, was evidently borrowed or specially bought for the event. "Sorry, I don't. I'm Constance, Helen's sister. She has told me so much about you. I came from the countryside especially for New York, taking advantage of the New Year's holiday. What an incredible coincidence to find you here." Edward felt as if the ground had opened beneath his feet. Helen's sister there, at the same event where he was trying to escape the dilemmas related to Helen herself. "Constance, it's a pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure is all mine. Helen can't stop talking about how wonderful you are as a boss. She said you even came to our house for Christmas. Can you imagine?" Edward noticed some curious glances from other guests. A woman, clearly from the countryside, speaking loudly and gesturing enthusiastically, clearly did not belong to that environment. But there was something so genuine in her joy that he felt immediately at ease. "Would you like to have something to drink? We can talk in a more private place." They headed to a less crowded area of the terrace, overlooking Copacabana Beach. Constance accepted a glass of champagne, but Edward noticed she was just holding it, clearly unfamiliar with the drink. "Tell me about Helen," Edward asked, genuinely interested. "Have you always been close?" "Always. It's just the two of us." Our parents died when we were young, and Helen practically raised me, even though she's only 2 years older. She has always been the more responsible, the more determined one. And Julia's father? Constance's smile faded slightly. Oh, him. Helen deserved much better. Roberto was a handsome man, spoke well, but he had no character. He married her when he found out she was pregnant, but he really just wanted someone to take care of him. Edward felt an inexplicable pang of anger. What happened? When Julia was 2, he just disappeared, left Helen with debts, no home. They lived in an apartment in his name, and a small child to raise. She had to start over from scratch. How did she manage? With a lot of struggle. She worked during the day in a store and studied at night to finish her business degree. Julia stayed with me on weekends in Savannah, but during the week it was just Helen alone. I saw her cry many nights, but she never gave up. Edward absorbed every word, building a more complete picture of the woman who had captured his attention. The strength required to overcome such adversities was impressive. And now, is she happy? Constance studied his face for a long moment, as if assessing his intentions. She's happier than she's been in years, I can tell you that. Working with you has done her a lot of good. For the first time since she came to New York, she feels she has stability. Constance's words hit Edward like a dagger. Stability, exactly what he was about to destroy with the demolition project. Constance, can I ask you a personal question? Has Helen mentioned any recent concerns? Any problems? Funny you should ask that. She called me last week, very distressed about the apartment. She said they have to move because the building was sold. She's desperate to find another place that fits the budget. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, the guilt weighing on him like a mountain. But you know what? Constance continued. Helen always finds a way. She's a woman of faith, believes that things happen for a reason. She said maybe it's time to move on, find a better place for Julia. A better place? Yes, she dreams of getting an apartment in a neighborhood with better schools, closer to work. She has always sacrificed her own dreams for her daughter, but now that she's employed at a good company with a decent boss. Constance abruptly stopped talking, seeming to realize she was revealing very personal information. Sorry, I think I'm talking too much. It's just that I get emotional seeing my sister happy after so much suffering. You don't need to apologize. It's good to know that you both are doing well. During the rest of the conversation, Edward learned more about the Anderson family. He found out that Constance had never married, dedicating her life to caring for their sick mother until her death 5 years prior. That Helen sent money religiously to her sister, even with her own financial struggles. That Julia was considered a prodigy in the family, the first to have the chance to attend university. Edward, Constance said as they prepared to say goodbye, can I ask you a favor? Of course. Take care of my sister. I'm not asking for anything more than what you already do, providing dignified work and respect. But she has been through a lot, and she deserves good people in her life. Edward nodded, unable to trust his voice. How could he promise to take care of Helen when he was the very source of her current anguish? That night, on the flight back to New York, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't cancel the Brooklyn project without raising suspicions and compromising his position in the company, but he could find a way to protect Helen without revealing his motives. The following Monday, he arrived at the office with a plan. He called Helen for a meeting and, trying to maintain a professional tone, made a proposal he had rehearsed all weekend. Helen, I've been following your work and I'm very pleased with your dedication. I would like to offer you a promotion. Her eyes lit up. A promotion? Yes. Senior executive assistant with a 40% salary increase and some additional benefits. One of them. It would be a housing allowance that would cover part of the rent for a better apartment. Helen remained silent for several seconds, clearly processing the information. Mr. Edward, this is very generous. But why now? I've only been working here for a month. As I said, your performance has been exceptional, and frankly, I need someone I can trust for greater responsibilities. It was a half-truth. Helen was indeed efficient, but the promotion was obviously motivated by other factors. How much would this housing allowance be? Edward had calculated an amount that would allow her to rent an apartment in a much better neighborhood, away from the demolition area. $3,000 a month. Helen paled. Mr. Edward, that is more than my current salary. I don't know if I deserve that much. Let me decide what you deserve, he said, more brusquely than he intended. The offer is on the table. Do you accept? She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decipher his motives. Edward struggled to maintain a neutral expression, but feared she might perceive the anxiety behind his professional facade. I accept, she finally said, and thank you very much for your trust. Edward nodded, relieved. It was just the first step of a complex plan to protect her. But at least now she would have the resources to find new housing before the demolition project was revealed. What he didn't know was that Mark, on the other side of the glass wall, had been watching the entire meeting with growing suspicion. Salary increases of 40% for newly hired employees were not part of the company's standard procedures, and Mark was determined to find out what was really happening with his partner. March arrived, bringing a false sense of stability that would be brutally interrupted by a series of events that would test everyone involved. Helen had found an apartment in Brooklyn, a middle-class neighborhood that offered better infrastructure and superior schools for Julia. The new home was slightly larger than the previous one, with 2 well-lit bedrooms and a small utility area that Helen transformed into a study corner for her daughter. Edward's housing allowance made possible what would have previously been a distant dream. "Mom, I still can't believe we got this apartment," Julia said one Saturday morning as they organized the books on the new shelf that Helen had bought. "It's so much better than the old one." "Thank Mr. Edward," Helen replied, carefully arranging Grandma's recipe book on the honor shelf. He was very generous with the promotion. But behind her gratitude, Helen harbored a restless, silent unease. She knew enough about the corporate world to understand that 40% promotions didn't happen without extraordinary reasons. Edward had become more attentive, more present, but also more reserved. There were moments when she caught him watching her through the glass walls of the office, a look filled with emotions she couldn't fully decipher. In the office, the dynamics had subtly changed. Mark had intensified his scrutiny of Edward's activities, questioning decisions he had previously accepted without discussion. The new Brooklyn project remained in a strategic limbo, with Edward inventing technical justifications to delay the start of the demolitions. "Edward, we need to talk," Mark said one Tuesday afternoon, entering the room without knocking. "The investors are getting impatient with the delays in Brooklyn." "What delays? We're on schedule," Edward lied, pretending to focus on the papers on his desk. The original schedule called for the start of demolitions in the first week of March. We're in the second half, and nothing has happened. Edward took a deep breath, knowing he couldn't delay indefinitely without raising irreparable suspicions. Some legal aspects needed to be reviewed. Better safe than sorry. What legal aspects? Our lawyers assured us everything was airtight. Environmental issues, new regulations from the city. It was another lie, but plausible enough to buy more time. Mark studied him with narrowed eyes, clearly dissatisfied with the answer. "Edward, are you sure everything is okay? You've been acting strangely lately." "I'm just being cautious with a $40 million investment. $40 million that will yield 120 when the project is completed. It's one of the best opportunities we've ever had." At that moment, the intercom buzzed. It was Helen. "Mr. Edward, your 3 o'clock meeting has arrived." "Send them in," Edward replied, relieved by the interruption. But Mark didn't move. Instead, he watched through the glass as Helen stood up to greet the visitors. Edward noticed the calculating interest in his partner's gaze. "Beautiful woman," Mark commented casually. "New to the company?" "3 months," Edward replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "And she already earned a substantial promotion from what I've heard." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. "She is efficient. I'm sure she is." Mark's tone carried implications that Edward preferred to ignore. When his partner finally left, Edward remained uneasy, realizing that his protection of Helen was beginning to draw unwanted attention. The event that would transform the situation from concerning to critical happened on a Thursday afternoon. Edward was reviewing contracts when he heard Helen answer the phone with an increasingly distressed voice. "Yes, I understand the gravity of the situation. No, I can't leave work right now. Please tell me she's conscious." Edward immediately abandoned the documents and left his office. "Helen, what happened?" She was visibly pale, her hand trembling as she held the phone. "It's Julia. She had a bicycle accident on the way to school. She's at General Hospital." "Let's go," Edward said without hesitation. "I'll take you. But the afternoon meetings—" "Forget the meetings, let's go." During the drive to the hospital, Helen remained silent, her hands clasped in her lap and her eyes fixed on the window. Edward could feel the tension radiating from her in almost palpable waves. He himself was more nervous than he expected. Julia had become important to him in a way he couldn't fully explain. "She'll be fine," he said, trying to offer comfort. "Julia is a strong girl. It's the only thing I have," murmured Helen, her voice choked. "If anything happens to her, nothing is going to happen." At the hospital, they discovered that Julia had fallen while trying to avoid a pothole on the bike path. The result was a fracture in her right arm and some scratches, but nothing that compromised her overall health. Still, she would need surgery to place a small metal plate, followed by physical therapy. "Mum, I'm sorry for worrying you," Julia said from the stretcher, trying to smile despite the pain. "I was in a hurry not to be late for biology class." "Don't worry about that now," replied Helen, carefully holding her daughter's hand. Edward watched the scene with a strange emotion forming in his chest. There was something deeply touching about the way Helen cared for her daughter, the unconditional love that shone through in every gesture. "Mr. Edward, you came too?" Julia asked, noticing his presence. "Of course I did. How are you feeling?" "Sore, but happy it wasn't anything more serious. The doctor said I'll be fine in a few weeks." When the doctor explained the necessary procedures, Edward observed Helen mentally calculating the costs: surgery, anesthesia, physical therapy, medications. Even with the basic health plan the company offered, the expenses would be considerable for the family budget. "Helen, about the costs," Edward began when they were alone in the hallway. "No!" she interrupted firmly. "I know what you're going to say, and the answer is no. You haven't even heard my proposal. I don't need to hear it. I'm not going to accept borrowed money, much less as a favor. It wouldn't be a favor. It would be an advance on your salary, a medical assistance that the company can offer." "Edward," she looked him directly in the eyes, for the first time using his name without the formal title. "I appreciate everything you've done for me. The promotion, the housing assistance, the attention to my work. But I can't accept more." "Why not?" "Because I don't want to be in debt to you in a way I can't repay." The statement carried multiple meanings, and Edward realized that Helen was setting boundaries, not just financially, but emotionally. She had noticed the special attention she received and was trying to keep the relationship on professional grounds. "Helen, I just want to help. I know, and that scares me." The raw honesty of the statement left them in silence for several seconds. Edward realized that his attempts to protect her had created a dynamic of dependency that she instinctively rejected. "All right," he finally said. "But if you change your mind—" "I won't change." They returned to the room where Julia awaited surgery, but the atmosphere between them had changed. There was a new tension, a mutual awareness of unexpressed feelings that made every word, every glance, heavy with meaning. During the surgery, Edward remained in the waiting room, officially because he had offered to give them a ride back, but in reality because he couldn't leave, knowing they were going through difficulties. Helen accepted his presence in silence, but maintained a physical and emotional distance that hadn't existed before. "Why are you doing this?" she asked during the long wait. "Doing what? Caring about us this way? We're just your employees." Edward considered several possible responses, but opted for an edited version of the truth. "You have become important to me. I can't pretend indifference." "That's dangerous, Edward." "For whom?" "For all of us." When Julia came out of surgery, everything had gone well. The doctor explained the necessary care and prescribed pain medications. Helen insisted on paying for everything herself, refusing any contribution from Edward. On the way home, Julia slept in the back seat under the effects of anesthesia. Edward and Helen remained silent, each lost in complex thoughts about the new dynamic that had established itself between them. "Helen," Edward said when they stopped in front of her building, "regardless of what happens between us, I want you to know that my concern for you is genuine." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know. That's why I'm scared." That night, Edward stayed up late, reflecting on Helen's words. She had accurately identified the dilemma he faced. His feelings for her were compromising his professional judgment, creating an unsustainable situation for both. But what Helen didn't know was that the situation was about to become even more complicated. The next day, Edward would find an envelope on his desk that would completely change the game. Confirmation that Mark had hired a private investigator to uncover the true reasons behind his recent behavior. The battle for the soul of the company and for the future of his relationship with Helen was just beginning. The envelope was on Edward's desk when he arrived at the office the Friday after Julia's accident. There was no return address, just his name typed in capital letters. Inside, he found photographs and a report that made his blood run cold. Images of him and Helen at the hospital, in the company parking lot, entering his building together on Christmas Eve. The investigator had been meticulous, documenting every encounter, every moment of closeness between them. The attached report was even more disturbing. It detailed Helen's unjustified promotion, the disproportionate housing assistance, and raised questions about the real nature of the relationship between the company's CEO and his assistant. There was also a handwritten note at the end. "Mark Sanders requests an urgent meeting to discuss the findings." Edward crumpled the photographs in his fists, anger rising in waves. How dare Mark investigate him? And more importantly, what were his true intentions with this information? The answer came an hour later, when Mark entered his office carrying a folder and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, Edward. I hope you received my correspondence." What is this, Mark? Since when do you hire investigators to spy on partners? Since when do those partners start making decisions that you're jeopardizing the company's future?" Mark replied, settling into the chair in front of Edward's desk with calculated calm. 40 million in delayed projects, inexplicable promotions, erratic behavior. I had to protect our investments. Protect from what exactly? From a CEO who seems to have lost objectivity because of an employee. Edward stood up abruptly, his hands resting on the desk. "Watch what you say, Mark. I'm speaking the truth. The photos don't lie, Edward. You're emotionally involved with your assistant, and it's affecting your business decisions. My personal life is none of your business. It becomes my business when it affects the company, and it affects it greatly. The Brooklyn project should have started 3 weeks ago. Investors are questioning our ability to deliver." Edward took a deep breath, trying to control the temperature of the conversation. Mark was right on some points, but his motivations were clearly opportunistic. "What do you want, Mark?" I want you to make a decision. Either resolve this personal situation so it doesn't interfere with business, or I will have to take this issue to the investor board." The threat hung in the air like a sharp blade. Edward knew Mark had the power to cause serious problems. As a minority partner, he had contractual rights that included the ability to call extraordinary meetings in cases of behavior detrimental to the interests of the company. "Are you blackmailing me? I'm offering an opportunity to resolve this internally before it becomes a public scandal." At that moment, Helen knocked on the door. "Mr. Edward, sorry to interrupt, but the documents for the Midtown project you were waiting for have arrived." The tension in the room was palpable. Mark looked at Helen with an evaluative gaze that made Edward clench his fists involuntarily. Helen noticed the charged atmosphere, but maintained her impeccable professionalism. "You can leave the documents here. Thank you, Helen." When she left, Mark smiled cynically. "Beautiful woman, smart too from what I've observed. I understand the attraction." "Mark, calm down, Edward. I'm not judging. I'm just saying you need to separate things. Business is business." "And what do you specifically suggest?" "First, fire the employee. Make up a plausible justification, pay a generous severance, but get her out of the company." "That's absurd." "Second, immediately resume the schedule for the Brooklyn project. No more inexplicable delays." "And what if I refuse?" "Then you'll have to explain to the board why you're sabotaging a $40 million investment because of an office romance." Edward sat heavily in his chair, the weight of the implications pressing down on his shoulders. If Mark took the case to the board, not only would his professional reputation be at risk, but Helen would be exposed to humiliating public scrutiny. "I need time to think. You have until Monday. After that, I will take the necessary steps to protect the company." Now, when Mark left, Edward remained motionless for several minutes, staring through the glass walls at Helen, who was working intently at her desk. She wore a navy blue suit that accentuated her eyes, her hair styled in an elegant bun, completely oblivious to the storm brewing around her. How could he fire her? How could he destroy the stability she had finally achieved? But how could he risk the company's future and expose her to a public scandal? Over the weekend, Edward isolated himself in his penthouse, weighing his limited options. He could give in to Mark's pressures, protecting the company but destroying Helen. He could resist, risking a public battle that would harm everyone involved. Or he could try a third alternative, remove Mark from the equation. The solution began to form when he recalled some irregularities he had noticed in Mark's financial reports over the past few months. Small discrepancies that, when analyzed in isolation, seemed like insignificant accounting errors, but together could suggest a pattern of mismanagement or at worst embezzlement. Edward spent Saturday and Sunday immersed in spreadsheets and contracts, reconstructing the financial trail of the projects overseen by Mark. What he discovered surprised him. There were at least $300,000 in questionable expenses over the last 6 months, all approved by Mark without proper documentation. On Monday morning, Edward arrived at the office an hour earlier than usual. When Mark showed up for the decision meeting, he found Edward sitting at his desk with an open folder in front of him. "Punctual as always," Edward said without looking up from the documents. "Sit down, Mark. We have a lot to discuss. I hope you've made the right decision about our conversation on Friday." "Oh, I've made several important decisions," Edward replied, finally looking at his partner. "The first was to conduct a complete audit of the projects under your supervision." Mark's confident smile faltered slightly. "Audit? Why?" "Professional curiosity, and I found some interesting things." Edward opened the folder and spread documents across the desk. Unverified receipts, inflated contracts, payments to non-existent suppliers. $300,000, Mark, in 6 months. "Can you explain these expenses?" Mark's face visibly paled. They're normal operational expenses. You know how the construction market is. I know exactly how it is. And I also know that this doesn't qualify as normal expenses. Edward stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Now I'm going to make a counter-proposal. You will withdraw your threats regarding my personal life and return the $300,000 to the company's coffers. In exchange, I will keep this discovery between us. You can't prove anything. I don't need to prove anything in court, Mark. I just need to present these irregularities to the board. They will draw their own conclusions. The silence that followed was tense and loaded. Mark calculated his options, clearly realizing that he had underestimated Edward's ability to fight back. And if I accept your proposal, then we continue as before. You take care of your area, I take care of mine, and my personal life remains out of the company's business. And the Brooklyn project? Edward had prepared this answer all weekend. It will be resumed according to the original schedule. The lie came easily, but inside, Edward knew Edward was just buying time. He still needed to find a way to protect Helen without compromising the company. I accept, Mark finally said, extending his hand. Edward shook his partner's hand, but both knew it was just a temporary truce. The war for the soul of the company would continue, only with different weapons. When Mark left, Edward watched Helen arrive for another day of work, greeting her colleagues with her usual warm smile. She had no idea that she had been at the center of a corporate battle, or that her presence in the company remained a ticking time bomb ready to explode. Edward had won a battle, but the war was far from over, and he still needed to resolve the fundamental dilemma: how to reconcile his feelings for Helen with the relentless demands of the business world. April brought a false sense of normalcy that lasted exactly 18 days. Edward had managed to temporarily neutralize Mark's threats, but the Brooklyn project loomed like a sword of Damocles over his head. The legal deadlines were inflexible, and investors were starting to ask increasingly direct questions about the delays. Helen, for her part, had adapted well to the new apartment. Julia was recovering quickly from surgery and was excited about her new school, which offered a science lab far superior to the old institution. Life seemed to be finally stabilizing for the Anderson family. The bomb exploded on a rainy Tuesday when Helen arrived at work to find an official envelope under her door. It was the final eviction notice for the old apartment, with a date that made her pale. The new owners had expedited the schedule. Demolitions would begin the following Monday. "Mr. Edward," she said, entering his office with the document trembling in her hands. "I just received this. It's about the old building where I lived." Edward pretended to examine the document for the first time, but he knew every word. He had signed the authorization to expedite the schedule 2 days earlier, pressured by a stormy meeting with investors threatening to withdraw funding. "How strange," he murmured, avoiding her gaze. "I thought you had more time." "I thought so too. Now I'm worried about the neighbors who still live there. Mrs. Eulalia from 3B is 80 years old and has no family in New York. Mr. Antonio from the second floor is unemployed and hasn't been able to find another place." Guilt hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. He had focused so much on protecting Helen that he had completely forgotten about the other families affected by the project. They were real lives, human stories that he had reduced to numbers in spreadsheets. "There must be some social assistance, some city program," he said unconvincingly. "Do you think?" Helen asked, her eyes shining with desperate hope. "Maybe you could use your contacts in the real estate sector to find out if there's anything we can do for them." Edward nodded, knowing he was digging his own grave. I'll see what I can find out." In the following days, Edward found himself living an increasingly complex lie. He had to pretend to be investigating a situation he had created himself, while Helen shared devastating details about the impact of the eviction on the former neighbors. "Mrs. Eulalia called me crying last night," Helen told him on a Thursday. She has lived in that apartment for 40 years. It's where she raised her children, where her husband died. Now she has to move to her niece's house in Queens. I'm so sorry, Edward murmured, the words sounding empty even to him. The worst part is that no one knows who bought the building. The realtor just says it's a big developer, as if that justifies destroying people's lives. Edward felt nauseous. Helen was, unknowingly, venting to the very person responsible for her suffering. The situation became unsustainable when Helen asked for a favor he couldn't refuse. Edward, I know it's a lot to ask, but could you come with me on Saturday? I want to help Mrs. Eulalia with the move. Maybe you could use your pickup to carry her things. Edward didn't own a pickup, but he couldn't admit that without explaining how Helen knew about his cars. Of course, he said. I'll get an appropriate vehicle. On Saturday morning, Edward rented a pickup and headed to the address he knew so well from the company's projects. It was the first time he stepped onto the site as an individual, not as a businessman. The difference in perspective was devastating. The neighborhood was alive. Children played on the sidewalks, elderly people chatted on the doorsteps of buildings, small businesses served the local community. There was a network of human relationships that Edward had never considered when he approved the Urban Revitalization Project. Helen was waiting for him in front of the building, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, her hair tied back in a ponytail. She was animatedly talking to a small, frail woman whom Edward recognized as Mrs. Eulalia from the social report he had never read. Edward, I'm so glad you came. Mrs. Eulalia, this is my boss, Mr. Edward Anderson. The elderly woman shook his hand with bony but surprisingly firm fingers. Nice to meet you, Doctor. Helen speaks very highly of you. It's a blessing to have a boss who cares about the employees. Edward felt as if he had been stabbed. The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Eulalia. For the next few hours, Edward carried furniture, boxes of personal belongings, and memories of a lifetime. Each item told a story. Yellowed wedding photographs, a china set saved for special occasions that never came, children's books from grown-up kids. This apartment was our first home, Mrs. Eulalia explained, pointing to a mark on the living room wall. There, my husband measured the children's height every birthday. 40 years of measurements. Edward looked at the mark, an irregular line climbing the wall, documenting decades of family growth. The following Monday, everything would be demolished to make way for luxury apartments that families like the Andersons would never afford. Mrs. Eulalia, said Helen, hugging the elderly woman, you have our phone number. If you need anything, just call. You are angels, replied the lady, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. In the midst of so much cruelty, there are still good people in the world. Edward was carrying the last box when he overheard a conversation that paralyzed him. Mom, did you hear who bought the building? Asked a middle-aged man who was helping with the move. Mr. Johnson found out. It's a company called Mendon Realty. Apparently it's owned by a wealthy man who doesn't care about ordinary people. Edward nearly dropped the box. Helen, who was beside him, commented indignantly, How absurd! How can someone destroy the lives of so many families just to make money? This Mendon must be a terrible person. Each word was a stab to Edward's heart. The woman he was in love with spoke of him with disdain, unaware that she was addressing the very target of her anger. On the way back, Helen continued to express her outrage about the inhumane greed of the business people who destroyed communities in the name of profit. Edward drove in silence, each of her words echoing in his mind like an accusation. Edward, are you okay? You're very quiet. Just tired, he lied. It was a tough day. It was tough for us for a few hours. For those people, it's a lifetime being destroyed. That night, Edward stayed awake in the empty penthouse, contemplating the panoramic view of the city. Down below, somewhere, Mrs. Eulalia was trying to adapt to a new home at 80 years old. Dozens of other families faced the same drama, all because of decisions he had coldly made in corporate meetings. For the first time in his career, Edward truly understood the human impact of his business. He had built his fortune on the displacement of people like Mrs. Eulalia, families who became invisible statistics in feasibility reports. Even more painful was the certainty that if Helen discovered the truth about his identity as the one responsible for the demolitions, he would not only lose any chance of a future with her, but also confirm her opinion of terrible business people who put profit above humanity. Edward was trapped in a trap of his own making. To keep Helen's love, he needed to hide who he really was. But living a lie was becoming more painful by the day. Monday arrived with the deafening noise of demolition machines. From his office in Midtown, Edward could not hear the sound of destruction, but he carried its weight in every heartbeat. When Helen arrived at work with red eyes from crying, he knew she had gone to witness the start of the demolitions. He did not have the courage to ask for details. Some truths were too heavy to be shared, even between people who loved each other. Make him bearing a series of revelations that would shake the carefully constructed foundations of Edward's life. The month began with a discovery he could never have anticipated. During a routine cleaning of her desk, Helen found a document that had been filed incorrectly. It was a copy of the acquisition contract for the land in Brooklyn, with Edward's signature clearly visible on the last page. Helen stood frozen for several minutes, rereading the document repeatedly, as if the words could change their meaning. When reality solidified in her mind, she felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Edward Henry Mendonça, her boss, the man who had become important in her life, who had cared for her and Julia with such attention, was responsible for the destruction of Mrs. Eulalia's home and so many other families. With trembling hands, she put the document in the drawer and tried to continue working, but concentration was impossible. Every time she looked at Edward through the glass walls, she no longer saw the kind man who had comforted her in the hospital, but the relentless businessman who displaced entire families in the name of profit. The hours dragged on like an eternity. Helen mentally relived every interaction she had had with Edward, reinterpreting gestures of affection as manifestations of guilt, generosity as attempts at compensation. The unexpected promotion, the housing assistance, all the special attention, everything made sense now under a sinister light. At 5 in the evening, as Edward prepared to leave, Helen knocked on the door of his office. "Mr. Edward, can we talk?" Something in the tone of her voice alerted him immediately. There was a formal coldness that hadn't existed for weeks, a distance that made him look up from the documents with apprehension. "Of course, Helen. Please, have a seat." She remained standing, her arms crossed in front of her body in a defensive posture. "I found this on your desk today," she said, placing the contract on the table between them. Edward felt the blood drain from his face. The moment he had feared for months had finally arrived. "Helen, I can explain." "You can explain how?" she interrupted, her voice trembling with contained emotion. "How do you explain comforting me about the eviction when you ordered the demolitions yourself? How do you explain offering me help to find a solution when you were the problem?" Edward slowly stood up, the words jumbling in his mind. He had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but now that it was happening, all justifications seemed inadequate. "Helen, when I signed that contract, I didn't know you. I didn't know your family would be affected. And that justifies it?" she asked, her eyes shining with tears of anger. "Does that justify destroying the lives of people who had nothing to do with your business?" "No. It doesn't justify. But when I found out you lived there, I tried to protect you." "Protect me?" Helen laughed bitterly. "Protect me by creating an elaborate facade, by giving me a promotion so I could move before finding out the truth. It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that. You used me, Mr. Edward. You pretended to care about me to relieve his own guilt." The accusation hit Edward like a bullet. "That's not true, Helen. My feelings for you are genuine." "Feelings?" She repeated the word as if it were an insult. What feelings can someone have who is capable of lying for months, looking into my eyes while I cried for Mrs. Eulalia, knowing he was responsible for her suffering? Edward walked to the window, unable to bear Helen's accusing gaze. I wanted to tell the truth, but I was afraid of losing you. And now you've lost anyway. You've lost any chance of trust, any possibility of honesty between us. When Edward turned to face her, Helen was already walking toward the door. Helen, wait. We can talk about this, find a way to... There's nothing to talk about, she said without turning around. I'll be here tomorrow to fulfill my professional contract, but that's all. Anything beyond work died today. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a tombstone being sealed. Edward remained alone in his office, watching through the glass as Helen mechanically gathered her belongings, carefully avoiding looking in his direction. In the following days, Helen maintained a glacial professional courtesy. She arrived on time, executed her tasks with impeccable efficiency, and left exactly on schedule without a word beyond what was strictly necessary for work. Edward found himself living in a personal hell of having the woman he loved just a few meters away, yet completely inaccessible. The situation worsened when Mark noticed the change in dynamics. "Trouble in paradise?" he asked one Thursday, observing how Edward melancholically contemplated Helen's desk. "I don't know what you're talking about. The ice princess out there is treating you like a stranger. Did you two have a fight?" Edward didn't respond, but Mark interpreted his silence as confirmation. "Maybe it's better this way," Mark continued. "Workplace relationships always end badly. At least now you can focus on business without distractions." The word distractions applied to Helen ignited Edward's anger. "Mind your own business, Mark. I am minding our business. And speaking of which, the Brooklyn project is finally moving forward. The demolitions were completed last week." Edward closed his eyes, remembering Helen's silent tears the previous Monday. Now he understood why. The last straw came when Edward learned that Helen had been looking for jobs at other companies. The information came through a known headhunter who called asking for references about her. "Edward, Helen Anderson is applying for a position at our company. Can you provide some information about her performance?" "What kind of position?" Edward asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Executive assistant at a multinational pharmaceutical company. Excellent salary, full benefits. She mentioned she was looking for new challenges." After hanging up the phone, Edward remained motionless for a long time. Helen was preparing to leave the company, to leave his life for good. The prospect filled him with despair. That afternoon, he made an impulsive decision. As Helen was getting ready to leave, he intercepted her in the elevator. "Helen, I need to talk to you. It's important." "Mr. Edward, I already said our conversation is over. Please, 5 minutes. After that, if you want, I'll never bring up personal matters again." She hesitated, then pressed the button to return to the office floor. In the empty conference room, Edward closed the door and turned to face her. "I heard you're looking for another job. It's a personal decision that doesn't interfere with my current work. Helen, I made terrible mistakes. I lied, manipulated situations, caused suffering to innocent people. But one thing has been true from the very beginning: my feelings for you. Your feelings don't erase the consequences of your actions. I know. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I can be different." Helen looked at him with a mix of sadness and exhaustion. "Edward, you don't understand. It's not about forgiveness or chances. It's about who you really are. And you are someone capable of destroying human lives for money, then lying to the affected people to feel better about yourself. I can change. Can you? Can you return Mrs. Eulalia's home? Can you erase the pain of the evicted families? Can you turn the rubble of Brooklyn back into homes?" Edward had no answer to those questions. Helen nodded, as if his lack of words confirmed everything she thought. That's what I thought. You can change your behavior, Edward, but you can't change the consequences of what you've already done. And I can't look at you without seeing the suffering you caused. She walked toward the door, then stopped. My resignation letter will be on your desk tomorrow morning. I'll fulfill the 2 weeks' notice and then leave your life forever. Adotish. When Helen left the room, Edward collapsed into a chair, the weight of defeat crushing his shoulders. He had lost not only the woman he loved, but also the opportunity to become the man she deserved. That night, alone in his penthouse, Edward contemplated for the first time the possibility that some mistakes were irreparable, some lies unforgivable, and some loves impossible to win through money or power. He discovered too late that business success had taught him nothing about how to be a decent human being, and now, when he finally understood the lesson, it was too late to apply it where it mattered most. November arrived, carrying a melancholy that settled like a persistent fog over Edward's life. 6 months had passed since Helen left the company. 6 months of mechanical routine and sleepless nights in which he incessantly relived every moment of their time together. The penthouse, once a symbol of achievement, had become a mausoleum of regrets. Helen had strictly adhered to the 2 weeks' notice, maintaining the same glacial professional courtesy until the very last minute. On the day of her departure, Edward had tried for one last conversation, but she simply handed him the keys. Mr. Edward organized access cards and a folder with all the pending tasks with the precision that had always characterized him. "I wish you success in your future endeavors, Mr. Edward," were his formal farewell words, as if he were addressing a stranger. In the following months, Edward discreetly discovered through contacts that Helen had secured a job at the multinational pharmaceutical company. Julia had been accepted into the University of Georgia for the veterinary program, fulfilling the dream her mum had cherished. Apparently, they were doing well, rebuilding their lives away from the shadow of Mendon Realty. The company continued to thrive under the renewed management of Mark, who had gradually taken on more responsibilities as Edward emotionally distanced himself from the business. The new Brooklyn project had been a resounding commercial success. All the apartments sold even before the completion of the construction, profits exceeding initial projections by 20%. But every time Edward passed by the site where Mrs. Eulalia's building once stood, he felt a weight in his chest that no financial success could alleviate. The modern residential complex rising on the site was, for him, a monument to his own moral blindness. Edward's gradual transformation had begun subtly, with small changes that Mark and the employees attributed to a new business maturity. Edward began to question projects involving the removal of established communities, demanding more detailed social impact studies and implementing more humane relocation programs for families affected by his ventures. "Edward, since when do you care so much about social assistance?" Mark had questioned during a meeting in September. "These programs cost a fortune and do not add value to the final product." "They add value to our reputation," Edward coldly replied, "and to my ability to sleep at night." The response left Mark perplexed, but he did not insist. Profits continued to be excellent, and if Edward wanted to spend money on social frills, it did not affect the bottom line. The most significant change came when Edward decided to create a social responsibility institute, using 5% of the company's annual profits for housing programs aimed at low-income families. It was his belated attempt to compensate for decades of urban development without consideration for human impacts. The institute would be inaugurated in December, exactly 1 year after that Christmas Eve that had changed his perspective on what truly mattered in life. Edward had chosen the date intentionally as a way to mark his moral rebirth. In the first week of December, he made a decision that had been maturing for months, to seek out Helen to formally apologize, not as an attempt to win her back, but as a personal necessity to fully take responsibility for his actions. Discovering her address was surprisingly simple. Julia appeared on a list of scholarship beneficiaries that his own company sponsored through the institute. The registered address was an apartment in Brooklyn, not far from where Edward had created the fictitious housing assistance. On Tuesday, December 20th, Edward parked his car in front of the building where Helen lived. It was a well-maintained middle-class building, surrounded by trees that created a welcoming atmosphere. He remained in the car for almost an hour, mentally rehearsing the words he wanted to say. When he finally gathered the courage to go up, he found out from the doorman that Helen was not home. She worked until 6 in the evening. Julia, however, had just returned from university for the winter break. "Julia, I'm Edward Mendon. I worked with your mom." There was a long pause before the response came through the intercom. "Mr. Edward? Wow, please come up. Apartment 8B. Julia greeted him at the door with a mix of surprise and curiosity. At 16, she had visibly matured, carrying a youthful confidence that indicated she was thriving at university. "Come in, please. Mom isn't here, but she should be back soon." The apartment was decorated with the same simple and cozy taste that Edward remembered from Helen's previous home. Grandma's recipe book occupied a place of honor on the shelf, surrounded by Julia's veterinary books and some family photographs. "How are you, Julia? How has university been?" "Amazing. The program is exactly what I dreamed of. The subjects are tough, but I love studying animal anatomy, physiology. I've already chosen my specialization, wildlife medicine." "Your mom must be very proud." Julia's smile softened slightly. "She is, but also worried. The change was hard for her, especially after what happened at your company." Edward took a deep breath. "That's why I came, Julia. I want to apologize to your mom for the mistakes I made. She never told me the details, but I know you hurt her a lot. Mom is someone who trusts easily, and when that trust is broken, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I need her to know that I deeply regret what I did." Julia studied his face with a maturity that belied her age. "Mr. Edward, can I ask you a question? Did you really care about us, or was it all part of some game?" The question hit Edward like a sharp blade. "My feelings for you have always been genuine, Julia. The mistakes I made did not change that." "Then why did you lie?" "Because I'm a coward," Edward replied with a raw honesty that surprised him. "Because I spent my whole life believing that money solved everything, that I could control the consequences of my actions. When I realized I had caused suffering to your family, I tried to fix things by hiding my responsibility, instead of owning up to it and facing the consequences." Julia nodded slowly. "Mom always said that the worst part wasn't discovering that you were responsible for the demolitions. It was finding out that you lied about it for so long." She's right. The lie was worse than the original mistake. At that moment, they heard the key turning in the lock. Helen entered the apartment carrying grocery bags, wearing a suit different from what Edward remembered. More modern, more expensive, highlighting that his new professional position was indeed better. When she saw Edward sitting in the living room with Julia, the grocery bags almost slipped from her hands. "Edward, what are you doing here?" "Good afternoon, Helen. I came to apologize." She placed the bags on the kitchen table with mechanical movements, clearly processing the unexpected situation. "Mom, he said he wants to apologize for the mistakes he made," Julia explained. Helen alternated her gaze between Edward and her daughter, then sighed deeply. "Julia, can you give us a few minutes?" "Sure, I'll study in my room." Once they were alone, Helen settled into the chair farthest from the sofa where Edward was sitting, maintaining a physical distance that reflected the emotional chasm between them. "You have 5 minutes," she said. "After that, I want you to leave and never come back." Edward nodded, accepting the conditions. "Helen, I didn't come here expecting forgiveness or trying to win back your trust. I came because I need you to know that I deeply regret every lie, every manipulation, every moment I put my cowardice above your dignity." Helen listened in silence, her face expressionless. "You were right about me," Edward continued. "I was exactly the kind of person you described. Someone capable of destroying lives for money and then lying to feel better. But you also showed me that I could be different." "Edward, let me finish, please. In the past few months, I've tried to become the man you deserved to know from the start. I created a social institute, changed the company's practices, and I'm trying to make up for decades of inhumane urban development. It's not enough to erase the past, but it's my attempt to honor what you taught me about responsibility and decency." Helen remained silent for a long time after he finished speaking. When she finally responded, her voice was heavy with deep sadness. "Edward, I appreciate that you came to apologize. I know it wasn't easy, but you need to understand one thing. I don't hate you. I never hated you. What I feel is disappointment, because I saw in those months a man I could have truly loved if he had been real. He was real, Helen. He still is. No, Edward, that man was a temporary performance. The real man is the one who signed the demolitions, who lied for months, who chose to protect his interests instead of taking responsibility. The changes you made afterward are commendable, but they don't erase who you really are." Helen's words were like death sentences for any hope Edward might still harbor. "I understand," he said, standing up. "Thank you for listening to me." "Edward," she called as he reached the door, "I sincerely hope you keep trying to be a better person. But do it for yourself, not for me or anyone else, and never show up here again." He nodded and left the apartment, knowing he was definitively closing a chapter of his life. In the elevator, Edward reflected on Helen's words. She was right. His changes had initially been motivated by guilt and the desire to win her back. Now, he needed to find out if he could be a better person without that external motivation. On Christmas Eve, exactly 2 years after that night that changed everything, Edward was once again alone in his penthouse. But this time, the solitude had a different flavor. It was not the desperate emptiness of before, but a conscious solitude inhabited by purposes and responsibilities he had chosen to embrace. At 8 in the evening, the intercom rang. Edward answered without expectations, imagining it was some delivery that had gotten the address wrong. "Mr. Edward, it's Constance, Helen's sister. Can I come up?" The surprise was so great that Edward took a few seconds to respond. "Sure, come up." Constance arrived carrying a fabric bag, similar to the one Helen had brought 2 years earlier. She wore simple but neat clothing, and her kind face carried an unusual seriousness. "Constance, what a surprise. Please come in." "Thank you. I came to New York to spend Christmas with Helen and Julia, but first I wanted to talk to you." Edward led her to the living room, the same place where everything had begun. "What can I do for you?" "I want to give you something," she said, opening the bag and pulling out a small package wrapped in plain paper. "These are cookies. I made them with Grandma Constance's recipe, the same one you learned with Helen that night." Edward accepted the package with his hands trembling slightly. "Constance, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything. Just listen." She settled onto the sofa and looked directly into his eyes. "Helen told me everything that happened, the lies, the demolitions, the hurt. She also told me about your visit a few days ago." Edward waited in silence. "You know, Mr. Edward, I raised Helen after our parents died. I saw her go through a lot of bad things, especially with her ex-husband. She developed an impressive ability to identify fake people, to protect herself from those who can hurt her. And she's right to protect herself from me." "She is," Constance agreed, surprising Edward with her frankness. "But I also know how to recognize when someone is genuinely remorseful. And I can see when someone has truly changed." Edward furrowed his brow. "How can you know if I've changed?" Because I spent the entire morning at the institute you created, talking with the families who are benefiting from the housing programs. I met Mrs. Rosa, who lost her home in one of your projects 3 years ago and is now getting a new apartment. I spoke with Mr. Joachim, who was relocated with dignity instead of simply evicted. Edward didn't know that Constance had done this investigation. Helen doesn't know I came here, she continued, and she won't know unless you tell her. I came because I believe some people deserve a second chance, especially when they demonstrate through actions, not words, that they have truly changed. Constance, Helen made it very clear that she doesn't want to see me again. Helen is protecting her heart. It's natural after everything she's been through. But overly protected hearts sometimes miss opportunities to be happy. Constance stood up to leave. I'm not saying you should be together, Mr. Edward. I'm just saying that the man I met through the families you've helped today is someone that Helen could respect, if she knew him without the weight of the past. At the door, she turned one last time. Eat the cookies thinking of Grandma Constance. She always said that food made with love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. After Constance left, Edward remained alone with the package of cookies, the familiar aroma awakening memories of that distant night that had changed his life forever. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to nurture a cautious hope that perhaps true love could be stronger than the mistakes of the past. But he knew that if there was any chance of a future with Helen, it would have to come from her, in her own time and terms. His only purpose now was to continue becoming the man she deserved, regardless of whether she would ever choose to give him a second chance. On that Christmas Eve, Edward ate Grandma Constance's cookies and for the first time in 2 years felt something akin to peace.